The wind didn't scream that day. It spoke in a low, sharp whisper. The kind of cold that made folks flip up their collars and keep their heads down, pretending not to see what wasn't their concern. Silas Hale rode into Cold Creek with more road dust than pride on his boots. Not hunting for conflict, just needing a sack of grain and a replacement part for his wagon wheel. He hadn't said more than a dozen words all week, and honestly, he preferred it that way. Silence never judged. It didn't bring up the wife buried beneath the cottonwood out back, or the foreclosure letter pressed in red across his ledger. But that day, silence didn't hold. Behind the saloon, past a tangle of broken crates and rusted spittoons, a crowd had gathered, drawn in slow and sour, like flies to something gone bad. No music played, no auction bell rang, only hushed voices and shifting eyes, glancing toward the alley, then away again, like even looking might stain their souls with shame. Silas climbed down from his horse slowly, tying the reins loose. He wasn't one for sticking his nose in other folks' business, but there was something about the stillness behind that saloon that pulled at him. Then he saw her. She wasn't crying, though maybe that would have been easier to watch. Her dress was simple, worn thin in places, the hem streaked with mud from a long road. One hand rested protectively on her swollen belly. The other hung lifeless at her side. Strands of wind-whipped blonde hair clung to a face that looked too pale for the season. Beside her stood a man with a tangled beard, eyes full of mean, and the stench of whiskey rolling off him. Another man leaned against a barrel with his arms crossed and a crooked smile stretching his mouth. Brothers, Silas would learn later. In-laws, to be exact, the kind of family that made you wonder if the law ever had any real teeth. "She don't look like much," one of them muttered to a pudgy merchant whose fingernails were black with dirt. "But she's strong. Child's due soon. Good stock. Useful if you got hands need warmin'." A couple of men chuckled. One spit in the dirt. Silas clenched his jaw. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just stared down at the broken earth beneath her feet. Like if she focused hard enough, she might disappear into it. "That's enough," the merchant grunted. "I ain't taking in no charity case with another mouth to feed." "She ain't charity," the bearded man replied. "She's blood. Husband's gone. Left us in debt. Just settlin' things proper." A voice from the crowd muttered, "Ain't no preacher at this auction." Silas stepped forward, slow and deliberate. One of the men turned to face him. "You lookin' to buy, stranger?" he sneered. The girl lifted her head just a little. Her eyes met Silas's, brief, direct. There was no begging in them, no tears. Just a deep, empty stillness, like something had been taken from her too many times to mourn it anymore. "No," Silas said evenly. "Just looking is all." But that wasn't true. There was a story in her silence. It carried anger, humiliation, a trace of stubbornness still clinging on. And something in Silas's chest twisted. He remembered holding a tiny body once, his own child, too early, too still, laid beside his wife a week later in the frozen earth. That ache had never left him. And now, this girl's quiet, it scraped against that same scar. The bearded man let out a dry laugh. "Don't worry. She ain't got it in her to fight back. Never did. Always kept her mouth shut. Makes things easier." The girl's lips moved, but no sound came out. She blinked, though slow, like a storm was gathering somewhere behind her eyes. "Where's the sheriff?" someone whispered behind Silas. "Probably paid to look the other way." A chill climbed up from Silas's bones, slow, mean, not the kind that leads to fists, but the kind that settles deep and stays. He stepped in closer. "How much?" he asked. The merchant and both in-laws turned. The girl didn't. The bearded man narrowed his eyes. "You serious?" Silas nodded once. Silence stretched long. $50, the man said, spitting near Silas's boot. "And a rifle. If you've got one." Without a word, Silas reached into his coat, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and tossed it toward the man. Then, slowly, he unhooked the old Winchester from across his back. "You're a damn fool," someone muttered in the crowd. The rifle was snatched quick like it was candy. Coins were counted without care. "She's yours." Silas didn't move. "What's her name?" The bearded man shrugged. "Does it matter?" He looked at the girl. She met his gaze. "It does," he said. Her voice came at last, faint and brittle. "Ada LeClaire." It cracked something wide open in him. Just a name. A whisper. But somehow that was enough to remind him she was a person, not some transaction. He held out his hand. She didn't take it, but she took a step toward him. That was all he needed. They walked through Cold Creek like shadows. The sun sagged low on the horizon. No one tried to stop them. A few folks watched, but most turned their eyes away. Guilt has a way of turning decent men into cowards. He helped her up into the wagon. Still no tears. No questions either. She sat quietly, hands resting over her belly, staring out ahead like someone walking a path she hadn't chosen and didn't understand. The wagon creaked and groaned as they rolled out of town. Dust spiraled behind them, catching the light like smoke. Neither said a word for miles. Eventually, Silas broke the silence. "You don't owe me nothing. You know that." She didn't respond, but after a moment she turned her head just slightly, just long enough to look at him. Then she looked away. Above them, the sky deepened to violet. Stars began to peek out timid and slow, like children sneaking past bedtime. They stopped for the night in a low hollow by the riverbed. Silas lit a small fire and handed her his coat. She took it without a word. He offered some jerky and a bit of cornbread. She chewed, barely tasting it. "I ain't the kind of man who rescues folks," he said softly. "Just couldn't leave you standing there." She said nothing. The fire snapped softly, casting flickers of gold against the dark. Finally she spoke, her voice rough and low. "They weren't always this cruel." He didn't say anything back. "Some things didn't need to be repeated. They said I was just another mouth to feed," she murmured. "Said after my husband died I didn't matter anymore." Silas kept his eyes on the flames. "They were wrong," he said. She glanced at him, then back toward the fire. "I don't even know where we're going," she whispered. "Me neither." "The baby kicked." She flinched slightly, and he noticed. "You all right?" She nodded once, then asked softly, "Why'd you do it?" He hesitated. "'Cause I saw my wife's eyes in yours." Ada blinked. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek and shimmered like it didn't want to let go. He rolled out a blanket for her and took the bare earth for himself. They didn't exchange another word that night. But something shifted in the quiet. A small, fragile warmth beneath the lingering cold. As Silas lay on his back and looked up at the stars, he wondered, not for the first time, if maybe redemption didn't come with trumpets, but crept in quietly. One wounded soul reaching out to another. And just before sleep took him, in the hush of the fire's dying glow and the frost gathering around them, Ada turned her head toward him and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer. Just closed his eyes. Because maybe that's how something begins. With nothing loud at all. And a long road ahead that would ask more than either of them had ever been prepared to give. The next morning came wrapped in heavy fog. Not the thin, drifting kind, but thick and woolly, wrapping everything in silence like cotton in a wound. Silas was awake before the sun. Years working the land had made that a habit. But today he waited just a little longer, watching the bundle of blanket beside the fire's fading embers. Ada hadn't stirred much through the night. She was curled up tight, both arms hugging her belly like she feared someone might reach in and take something from her while she slept. Her breaths were light and measured, like a woman who'd learned the cost of making noise. He rose, brushed the frost from his coat, and started the fire again. Every motion was quiet, careful, like he was back working near wild horses. By the time her eyes blinked open, the fire had grown to a soft, pulsing glow and steam was rising from the coffee pot. She didn't speak. Just sat up slowly, steadying herself with one hand while the other rested on her stomach. "Coffee?" he asked. She nodded once. He poured a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it in both hands, sipping carefully, metal rattling gently against her lip. "I reckon we can make it to the ranch by sundown," he said. "It ain't much, but it's dry. Got a bed. Stove's fussy, but it'll work if you feed it." She didn't respond. And he didn't press her. Sometimes silence didn't mean someone had nothing to say. Sometimes it meant they were still learning how to feel safe saying it. They rode on without conversation. The wagon wheels creaked beneath them. The mule huffed and flicked its tail now and again like it was swatting at ghosts. Trees slid past like tall, skinny memories wrapped in fog. Their bark was slick and dark, like bone left out in the rain. Ada asked no questions. Nothing about where they were headed. Nothing about the land or the man beside her. So he started talking anyway. "I was raised out in Kansas," he said. "Dusty as sin and twice as mean. My pa was a preacher. Ma didn't make it past my sister's birth. And my sister, well, she didn't last past 6 winters." Ada didn't answer. Just sat still as the hooves clopped on. "I left when I was 16. Thought I'd find gold. Ended up herding cattle." He glanced sideways. Still nothing except her fingers curled just a little tighter in her lap. "My wife, Ruth, was better than I ever deserved," he went on. "She had cinnamon freckles. Could shoot straighter than me and bake better than anyone for miles. We lost our first little one during the spring freeze," Silas said quietly. "She died 2 months later. The words slipped from him like breath, part memory, part wound left unstitched. Ada turned her head just a bit in his direction, then looked back out toward the road ahead. But something in her posture shifted, shoulders less tight, less braced. By the time they reached the ranch, the fog had pulled back. Sunlight poured in through the bare branches, laying gold across the frost, making it shimmer like it held secrets waiting to thaw. The house was no beauty, just a tired old structure with weathered boards, a porch that leaned, and 2 windows missing their shutters. Still, it looked like it had nothing to hide. Honest in its age and its wear. Silas helped her down from the wagon, making sure not to hold her hand any longer than necessary. She moved carefully but without help, each step deliberate, steady. "Come on. I'll show you inside." She followed him through the creaky door. Inside, the place was plain as a biscuit, bare wooden walls, a small table with 2 chairs, an iron stove in the corner, and a side room with a bed that barely had enough space for one. The quilt on it was old, his wife's handiwork, still folded across the top like it hadn't been disturbed in years. She paused at the doorway. Her fingers reached out slowly, brushing the patchwork with hesitation, like she expected it to snap at her. "I can take the barn tonight," Silas offered. "You should rest." Her voice came out low and even. "No. I'm not helpless." He gave a small nod, unsure what to say to that. So he didn't say anything at all. She sat on the edge of the bed, boots still on, spine straight, like she wasn't ready to sink into anything just yet. Silas brought her a basin of warm water and left it beside her without a word. Then he stepped outside and started chopping wood. Not because they needed the heat, but because sometimes the silence inside screamed louder than any fight. By the time dusk crept in, she had cleaned up and folded the quilt neatly. Her damp hair clung to her face, which had regained the faintest bit of color. But her eyes, those stayed guarded. Supper was quiet: bread, beans, and a handful of dried apples. She ate slowly, methodically, like someone out of practice with hunger, unsure how to trust the taste of comfort. Across the table, Silas finally broke the silence. "You're safe here." She didn't lift her gaze. "Safe don't always mean not scared," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "I know." A long silence passed between them, filled only by the crackle of the stove and the settling groan of the old house. Then, almost like an afterthought, she said, "His name was Matthew. My husband." Her tone was flat, almost distant. "He wasn't a bad man, just worn thin. Fever took him after the baby started kicking." Silas didn't interrupt. He just listened. "His family said it was my fault, that I brought the sickness, that I ate more than I earned. They told me to go, but not before making sure I'd been handled." Her voice cracked at the end, just slightly. "I'm sorry," Silas said. "They called me a burden," she continued. "Said I'd cursed them." Silas looked at her hands, calloused, trembling, too small for the weight they'd carried. "You're not a burden," he told her. She looked up, sharp and fast, like the words had stung. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to." She went quiet again. Then, a pause later. "You still thinkin' about making me your wife?" He shook his head gently. "Only if that's what you want." She drew in a slow breath. "I won't ask. Then I won't push." They sat like that for a long time. 2 people, 2 pasts, and all their grief laid out between them like keepsakes too valuable to throw away. The days that followed found a kind of rhythm. She swept, cooked what little they had. Sometimes she'd sit on the porch for hours, eyes fixed on the horizon like she was waiting to remember something she'd forgotten. Other times, she helped with the mule, fingers brushing its nose as if she was trying to recall what gentleness felt like. Silas gave her space, let her keep the silence, own it. But one evening, while he was fixing a section of broken fence near the paddock, she walked out carrying a steaming cup in both hands. "Coffee," she said simply, holding it out. He blinked at her, surprised, and took it with care. "Thank you." She didn't say anything else. Just stood near, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her there like the warmth of fire after a long cold spell. "I used to hum," she said after a while. "When I was little. I haven't in a long time. Maybe it'll come back." She gave no answer. But the next morning, as she folded laundry on the porch rail, he caught it. A hum. Faint. Uncertain. But real. Just a few notes, barely carried on the wind. He didn't look up. Just kept whittling the piece of wood in his hands, letting the sound speak for itself. That night, the rain came hard. Thunder rolled out across the hills, deep and distant. He lit the lantern and sat by the stove. The room was warm, the quiet dense with something unsaid. She appeared in the bedroom doorway, her shadow long in the flickering light. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked. He set the knife down on the table. "I think maybe they believe in us." She nodded and stepped forward into the glow. "You've been good to me," she said. "But I'm still scared." "I am too," he replied. "I don't want to belong to anyone." "You don't." "I don't want to be rescued." "Then just stay." For once, the silence between them didn't feel heavy. It felt warm, like something was finally settling instead of waiting to break. She crossed the room and sat down across from him. The lantern flickered softly, casting golden shadows across her face like a memory being gently remembered. When she spoke, her voice had more weight to it. "I don't know how to be loved." "You don't have to," Silas replied without hesitation. She blinked slowly. "You just have to sit here," he added, his voice low, "and not run." She looked at him, long and searching. Then, after a pause, she reached across the table. Not to take his hand, but to place her palm beside his, quiet and steady. It wasn't contact. It was closeness. A beginning. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. But inside, something delicate and sacred held its ground. Unmoving, unafraid. And in that still moment, with thunder rolling softly through the distant hills, Silas understood something profound. She wasn't trapped in silence anymore. She was learning to step out of it. That spring came earlier than anyone expected. Snow that had clung to the fence posts finally melted into the thirsty earth, and the soil cracked open like it had been holding its breath. New buds pushed up on trees that hadn't dared bloom in years. And out on the porch of a weather-worn ranch house just past the edge of Cold Creek, a woman stood barefoot in the morning sun. One hand rested on her growing belly, the other on the porch rail. She wasn't smiling, but she was breathing deeper. From the field, Silas watched her, one boot in the stirrup as the mule shifted its weight beneath him. There was something about the way she stood there, quiet, grounded, still relearning how to occupy space, that moved something deep in him. Something without a name. Lately, Ada had been rising before him some mornings. She'd have coffee brewed and the table set with quiet precision. She still didn't speak much, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't born of fear anymore. It had become something else entirely. Soil. And in that soil, something had begun to grow. One morning, she asked if she could help fix the barn roof. He said no. She said she was going to help anyway. So he handed her the nails and showed her how to set them. Her hands were slow but sure. When she slipped on the shingles and let out a startled gasp, he caught her. Just a hand on her back, her palm pressing gently against his chest. They didn't move. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, her cheeks flushed. But the warmth on her face wasn't fear. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch, stitching baby clothes from old fabric, curtains, flannel shirts, anything she could spare. Her hands worked like they were remembering. Thread, needle, breath. She hadn't had much in life, but she wanted something soft waiting when the baby arrived. Silas, on his end, had been building something too. In the shed, by lantern light, he was shaping a cradle, working the wood slowly, carefully, like it mattered. When Ada found it one morning, she didn't speak a word. She just ran her hand along the smooth curve of the frame. And later left a jar of homemade jam beside his coffee cup. In town, the whispers about them had started to shift. At first, it had been. He bought her at an auction. Then came. She's quiet. Must not be all there. But recently, the tone had changed. He's building her a porch swing. She's teaching his mule to lower its head for sugar cubes. People talked. They always would. But Ada LeClaire walked with her head a little higher now. And Silas? He didn't answer rumors before, and he sure wasn't about to start now. One afternoon, she surprised him. "I'd like to go into town," she said. "You sure?" he asked, eyeing her belly. She nodded. "I need to see something besides these four walls." She wore her old dress tight around her stomach, and her late husband's hat pulled low over her brow. Her boots didn't match, but she stepped into the general store like she remembered exactly who she was. Mrs. Fenwick, the storekeeper's wife, arched an eyebrow. "You look well, dear." Ada's voice didn't flinch. "I feel well." They bought flour, some beans, and a roll of blue ribbon. Silas asked about the ribbon, but she didn't answer. Later, though, back at the house, he saw her tying it into her braid as she looked at her reflection in the window. For the first time in a long while, She saw someone worth looking at. That night, with the oil lamp humming low, Silas opened an old record box, not full of music, but old letters, recipes, and one photo that had survived the fire. Burned at the edges, it was a picture of his late wife. She was beautiful, Ada said, turning the photo gently in her hands. She was, Silas replied. A beat passed. Then he added softly, and kind. The kindest person I've ever known. Ada traced the edge of the photograph with her finger. I'm not her. No, he said. You're not. She looked up, bracing herself like she expected to be compared. But you're here, he said. Her eyes filled glass bright, but no tears spilled. Instead, she spoke. I want to plant tomatoes. He blinked, surprised. Right by the fence, she said. And maybe some lavender. I remember the smell from when I was small. We'll pick up seeds this week, he told her. Good. And he just kept watching her. Quietly, carefully, like she was something rare finally learning how to stay. Something had started shifting. Not just inside Ada but in the space around her too. Like the house itself had finally let out a long-held breath. Like the land had taken notice and understood it had someone new to care for now. And then came the knock. It was late. Too late for a neighbor to be stopping by. Silas rose from the table and reached for the rifle that hung by the door. Ada froze mid-step. Another knock. Firmer this time. When Silas pulled open the door, 3 men were standing on the porch. One wore a wide-brimmed hat, eyes narrow and flat. Another chewed tobacco like it was the only thing keeping his jaw moving. And the third? Silas recognized him instantly, Ada's brother-in-law. Evenin' Hale, the man said, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Silas didn't return it. You're not wanted here. We just came to check on family, the man replied smoothly. She's not yours to check on. She's carryin' blood, the man said as he took a step forward. Our family's blood. Ada appeared behind Silas then, one hand braced on the doorway, the other resting protectively on her belly. She's already told you no, Silas said, his voice even. That ought to be the end of it. Take it easy, the man said with a smirk. We ain't looking for trouble. Just a little talk. Maybe bring her home. She is home. The man's smile dropped a fraction. His eyes narrowed. You think buying her changes anything? Ada's voice cut through, clear and steady. You're not taking me. Silas glanced back at her. Her face was pale, but her chin stayed firm, her jaw clenched with purpose. The brother-in-law spat into the dirt. You think you'll raise the baby without our name? Without paying what's owed? You gave up any claim when you sold me, she said flatly. I'm not your debt anymore. He laughed, but it came out sour. This ain't finished. Without a word, Silas shut the door. Ada didn't shake, didn't cry, not then. But later that evening, as she sat out on the porch in the dark, he heard her breath hitch. He walked out with a blanket folded over his arm. You figured they'd come, she said quietly. He sat down beside her. I did. They want the baby. They can want all they like. A pause followed. The wind stirred through the trees like it was listening. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I. She turned to face him. Her expression was stripped of everything but truth. I don't want to run anymore. You won't have to. She held his gaze for a long moment. And in that look, something passed between them, like hands reaching without touch, like promises made in silence. He laid the blanket across her shoulders. I've been thinking, she said softly. Maybe I will ask. Ask what? She looked down, then off toward the trees. A quiet smile touched the corner of her lips. To be your wife. Silas didn't speak. He just reached for her hand and held it. That one small gesture, quiet, steady, said more than any wedding vow. Inside, the fire crackled low and warm. Outside, beneath the recently thawed earth, the seed she'd asked to plant waited. Just like her, ready to begin again. Ada woke the next morning with a strange weight pressing on her chest. It wasn't the child. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm. The birds hadn't begun their song. Even the wind moved low and slow, like it was bracing itself. Something in the air had shifted. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it deep. She placed a hand over her belly and waited. From outside, the rhythmic thump of an axe rang out, steady and dependable. Silas was splitting wood by the barn. Each strike landed like the heartbeat of a day they were trying to live normally. Familiar. Reliable. Safe. But Ada had learned that safety was often just a thin blanket, one that didn't always keep out what mattered most. She stepped out into the soft morning light, her shawl drawn close, her braid loose down her back. Silas saw her coming and set the axe aside. You all right? He asked. She gave a short nod, but her expression stayed tight. Something's wrong. He didn't doubt her for a second. He'd learned her instincts were like the seasons, hard to predict, but almost always right. By midday, the wind had picked up, dragging dust across the hills like it was clearing the land for something meaner. The mule paced near the fence. Ada stayed close to the house, eyes sweeping the horizon with quiet urgency. When the riders showed up, they didn't rush. They came slow, deliberate, like they wanted to be seen. Same 3 men. Only this time they came armed, and with none of the false civility from before. The brother-in-law rode at the front, a smug look on his face, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over eyes full of challenge. Silas stepped off the porch, rifle slung over his shoulder, jaw clenched like iron. Ada stood in the doorway behind him, one hand resting against the frame, the other curled protectively over her belly. Afternoon, the man drawled, spitting into the dirt. We've come to collect what belongs to us. Silas didn't flinch. You came looking for a fight. You've got no paper, no preacher's words to back you. She's still ours, far as the law's concerned. And that baby? That's family. She was never yours, Silas said, his voice low and steady. Not then. Not now. The man climbed off his horse, slow and smug, pulling a folded sheet from his coat. Got a signature here, he said, waving it like it proved something. Her husband, God rest him, owed us half the land. He's gone now, but she's carrying what's left of him. That means we're owed what's still standing. From the porch, Ada LeClaire answered before Silas could. Her voice was iron cold. You'll get nothing. The man's gaze snapped toward her. You think this man can shield you? He's got a patch of dirt and a quiet mouth. You really think that makes you safe? Ada didn't blink. I don't think, she said calmly. I know. He stepped up toward the porch. Silas raised the rifle. Stop right there. The man froze in place. You really gonna shoot your wife's own blood? He asked with a sneer. If that's what it takes, Silas replied, never breaking eye contact. The man chuckled and stepped back. You think this ends here? You don't think I can drag this to court in Cold Creek? Try it, Silas said. But you'll lose. We were married yesterday morning. Pastor Boone signed the ledger. His wife and the clerk were there. The man stiffened. You're bluffing. Ride into town. Ask around. Ada stepped down beside Silas then, took his hand in plain view of the men who once bartered her name like livestock. I chose him, she said, and that's what you never understood. You can't sell what you never owned. His eyes burned with the sting of pride lost, because deep down he knew it. He'd already lost, not just legally, but in presence, in meaning. Still, he left them with a final bitterness. You'll regret this, he muttered. When that kid's sick or hungry or crying for a name and you've got nothing left to give. Ada's chin lifted. Then I'll give them this. The story of how we stood our ground. He didn't say another word. Turned, mounted up, and rode off. The others followed close behind. Silence returned to the homestead. But it carried a weight now, tight and coiled like a rope pulled near to snapping. Silas set the rifle aside and exhaled, his shoulders easing for the first time all day. You really went into town and married me? Ada asked, her voice light, teasing just a bit at the edges. I did, he said. Didn't want to assume. Figured you'd say no. I was going to ask you today. He glanced over. Well, beat you to it. She smiled then. Not big, just soft and real. The kind of smile that doesn't perform, only reveals. That evening, the wind eased and the world turned gold. They sat together on the porch swing he'd finally finished, her head leaning gently against his shoulder. Inside the house, the cradle waited. Next to it, a quilt with her name sewn in small, careful stitches. Ada looked out over the prairie and spoke in a hush. You think they'll come back? Maybe, Silas said. But if they do, they won't make it past me. She nodded. I believe that. A pause. Then, I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again, she said. You're not safe, he answered quietly. Not in this world. But you're not alone. She closed her eyes. That night, she lay beside him in his bed. No promises spoken, but something unspoken passed between them. A vow that didn't need words to be real. Outside, spring kept creeping forward. Slow and stubborn like everything worth growing. And deep within her, another kind of seed leaned toward the light. The fire came in the dark. Not sudden, not loud, but slow, like something crawling up from the edge of a nightmare. It started in the hay, and by the time Silas smelled the smoke, the barn was already lost. He threw himself from bed, shotgun in one hand, tugging on boots with the other. Ada followed, robe trailing behind her, one hand on the doorframe, the other cradling the baby still inside her. The flames had already leapt high into the rafters. Sparks shot upward like furious stars. The mule screamed, wild-eyed, struggling at its tether. Silas ran into the blaze, jacket over his head, lungs burning. He cut the rope, slapped the animal's flank hard, and staggered back through the heat, coughing, eyes streaming. Behind him, the barn let out a terrible groan. A beam crashed down. "Ada!" he choked, stumbling toward the porch. She was already there, calling his name, voice sharp and fierce. And when he reached her, half collapsing into her arms, she pulled him close like she was dragging him from the gates of hell. The neighbors came when they saw the smoke. Buckets in hand, faces drawn with urgency. Mrs. Fenwick brought bread, even with the sky still glowing red. The young storekeeper arrived barefoot, hauling a jug of water in both arms. Someone said they'd seen a rider leaving the property not long before the flames caught. No name was spoken. None needed. Silas didn't curse. He didn't shout. He simply stood and watched as the barn folded in on itself, like a prayer offered and unanswered. Then, without a word, he turned back to the porch. Ada LeClaire followed him, her hands slipping into his. The next morning, smoke still lingered, curling in thin threads against the pale sky. Ash clung to the window panes like soot-tinged memories. But inside the house, the cradle remained untouched. And so did the quilt. Ada sat at the table, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes held steady. Her voice was quiet but firm. "They're trying to break us," she said. Silas poured water into a dented tin cup and placed it gently in front of her. "They won't," he said. She studied his face for a long time. And then, simply, "I believe you." He reached across the table and took her hand. His calluses, once rough as gravel, had softened since the day she came. Or maybe it was her skin that had changed, meeting his halfway. Later that week, Ada went into labor. It came suddenly in the hush before dawn while the wind moaned low across the open land like it knew what was coming. Silas didn't panic. He moved with calm hands and sharp focus, boiling cloth, fetching water, and sending for the neighbor woman who'd birthed 3 of her own. Ada gripped the bedpost so hard her knuckles turned bloodless white. The pain was long, unforgiving, but real. When the baby's cry broke into the room, it rang louder than any fire. A boy, dark-haired, lungs full, wailing his way into the world like he'd arrived with something to prove. Ada wept as she cradled him against her chest. Silas didn't shed a tear, but he stepped outside, looked to the rising sun, and whispered his wife's name into the morning wind. Not Ruth. Ada. She was his wife now. And this was their world. The weeks that followed were quiet, but they were far from still. With help from neighbors who no longer whispered behind their hands, they rebuilt the barn from the ground up. Ada planted tomato vines along the fence line and tucked lavender under the windows. The baby's laughter came slow but steady, and when it came, it filled the house like light breaking through after a storm. One afternoon, Silas found her outside, sitting in the dirt. The baby nestled in her arms, a ribbon tied in her hair. A half-smile tucked at the edge of her mouth like a secret she didn't need to keep anymore. "I thought this place would kill me," she said. "It didn't." "No," she said softly. "It let me live." And Silas, who had once buried the only family he'd ever known, realized now he'd built another. Not from blood, but from something harder to break. From fire. From silence turned to speech. From grief that had taken root and grown something new. That autumn, they held a second wedding. This time with neighbors as witnesses. With rings exchanged beneath the cottonwood where Ruth lay, Ada placed a single flower on the grave. Not in mourning, but in gratitude. At supper, Mrs. Fenwick raised her glass and declared, "May the child carry both their names." And he did. In town, no one questioned them anymore. They were one. A man of few words who guarded what mattered. A woman once treated like property, now standing fully seen. And a child born between 2 storms carried in arms that had both lost and held on. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, Ada would hum on the porch. And Silas, rocking their boy gently in his arms, would close his eyes. Not to sleep, but to remember. He remembered how it started. With a whisper behind a saloon. With silence that never begged to be rescued. With a man who didn't ask for love, but waited long enough to be worthy of it. Let others write their histories about gunslingers and outlaws. This one was written in ash and soil. In blue ribbon and stitched quilts. In the steady breath of survival. And for anyone who ever doubted that broken things could bloom, Ada LeClaire had the answer. She lived it. There, on that wind-touched prairie. Beneath skies that had known both sorrow and sunlight, a woman once sold for debt, now sat as a matriarch. Head high, heart full, because love out here wasn't sung in ballads. It was carved slow and deep, lit by fire, and kept alive by those brave enough to stay.